several days at Zaporizhia in a hospital because of injury to his ribs. His neighbors also had injuries to their ribs, and so he was conversing with people who were sympathetic, but at the same time they were under fire. But as Anatol says, the fire was inexact, often not severe enough to damage anything, but perhaps hit some residences. There's always the accident, but not the impression of Verdun that I've been giving out these many months. And I'll take that back.
Well, in Bakhmut, where the fighting is in the east, and I talked to soldiers who'd fought there, there it really is like Verdun, absolutely, but not the cities behind the lines.
So I'll be more articulate. Bakhmut, yes. Verdun. Zaporizhia, no. However, nuclear weapons, Anatol. You've commented that the Crimea story is the danger point, perhaps the most dangerous point we've seen since the Cold War, incidents like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we know now there were scary moments when nuclear weapons were available. How do you assess the provocation talk out of Moscow, the testing of Satan II, the mention repeatedly by Mr. Putin talking about his strategic weapons, and now his talk about tactical nuclear weapons, the suspension of the New START treaty, the U.S. now stopping data about where the missiles are, where the bombers are, that the kind of dialogue that's gone on since the end of the Cold War. How do you assess that from the Moscow point of view? Is this Putin rattling a nuclear saber, or are they prepared to use those tactical nukes?
Well, I mean, this war has been a disaster for Russia's conventional forces. I mean, just about every bit of them has failed in one way or another. And that being so, inevitably, Russia is going to emphasize the only area where it still is a military superpower, which is the nuclear area, which also, of course, is terrifying in terms of its ability to destroy the world. And my sense is that Moscow would only use even tactical nuclear weapons in the absolutely last resort, and would only begin the process of escalating towards the use of nuclear weapons if it was facing complete defeat in Ukraine and the loss of Crimea. So really, I mean, everything, or not everything, but much depends on what happens on the battlefield. Ukraine has been promising this new offensive, but then again, a couple of days ago, President Zelensky said that the offensive can't, in fact, be launched without many more Western weapons, so we don't know when it will take place. My sense is that if Russia thought that it was going to lose Crimea and face complete defeat in Ukraine, then it would begin a process of escalation. It wouldn't begin with nuclear weapons. It might begin, for example, by destroying American satellites, which have given so much very useful intelligence to the Ukrainians. But then, if America retaliated, then one could see a cycle of escalation ending, I think, or at least so I'm told by experts who I trust, ending not with Russia launching a full-scale attack on the United States, but using tactical nuclear weapons stationed in Belarus to hit NATO air bases in Poland. Not cities, just air bases. And then, the question would be, would the Biden administration risk the existence of the United States to defend air bases in Poland? Or at this point, would the Europeans in particular insist on moves to a ceasefire? But this, of course, is all what you might call informed speculation. We are not at that point yet. And if the Russians, manage to stop the Ukrainian offensive, then the likelihood is that we never will get to that point.
Crimea seems to be the centerpiece in your presentation here. Crimea is the thing that Russia cannot surrender. It would destroy it rather than surrender it. Is that the way to understand this?
Pretty much. I mean, it would be the end of the Putin regime. And the overwhelming majority of Russians regard it simply as part of Russia. And for the Russian elites, it would mark the end of Russia as a great power, just as, if America lost Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, that would be the end of American power in the Pacific. But on the other hand, I have to say, the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians, very much, it has to be said, inspired by the unanimous line on television and from the political classes, are equally determined, or say that they are, to recover Crimea for Ukraine. I was quite surprised by the unanimity of the Ukrainians on this because, after all, Crimea was not part of Ukraine before 1954. But now it has become, a symbol of complete victory, the defeat of this, illegal invasion, which has done so much terrible damage to Ukraine and has killed so many Ukrainians. And of course, they, by the same token, they hope that the loss of Crimea would bring down the Putin regime and possibly even break up the Russian Federation. So I don't think you're going to get any move from the foreseeable future, from the Ukrainian government, either to propose or accept a compromise peace leaving Crimea in Russia.
Russia claims that it's ready for a long war. Russia claims that there will be mobilization of another 400,000. Russia claims that this is just the beginning. Is that how Ukraine hears this? Do they believe Russia can fight on indefinitely with these losses?
I think they certainly think Russia can fight on for a long time. But obviously the Ukrainians are hoping that with new Western weaponry, that they can break through the Russian lines and end this stalemate. And, we will just have to see what happens in the next months on the battlefield. Maybe they can. The Ukrainians have astonished the world with their victories over the past year. But on the other hand, if the Russians dig in and, backed by masses of artillery, then, the Russians perhaps also stand a good chance of stopping the Ukrainians. Because in Bakhmut, it's very evident both from the pictures one sees, but also the veterans I talk to, that this has become overwhelmingly an artillery war there, very like Verdun, as you said. And the Russians are running short of long-range missiles, but they still do have huge numbers of guns and shells.
Let me put this together, if I understand correctly. The Ukrainians believe that they can and will retake Crimea if they're given the right long-range weapons and sophisticated help of the NATO arsenal. The Russians believe that Crimea is the jewel and that Russia cannot surrender it, and therefore tactical nuclear weapons are not ruled out in the event that Crimea falls. Have I got that all correctly? Have I got that formula correct? That's a formula for catastrophe, Anatol. Do I understand that correctly?
Absolutely. That is precisely the position, yes.
So the diplomats must sort out something that is not solvable at this point. Ukraine will not lay down its weapons until it has Crimea. Russia will fight for Crimea to the end, and then it will use nukes against NATO. Oh, Anatol. Anatol Lieven of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's traveling back to the United Kingdom from his days in a hospital in Zaporizhia near the front lines of the battle for the Donbass. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.
Well, I have heard response from the Wall Street Journal, yes. The newspaper says it vehemently denies the FSB allegations. It says it's seeking Mr. Gershkovich's release, and it described him as a trusted and dedicated reporter. As I say, he's well known to Western journalists who are still in Moscow, so quite a shock, I think.
Briefly, Steve, is this fairly unusual? It seems that there hasn't been an American journalist arrested, since the Cold War, probably.
It is unusual. I can't remember, actually, a Western journalist being arrested and accused of espionage in Russia since Soviet times. Obviously, over the last year, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we've seen a lot of pressure being put on Russian journalists writing in Russian, broadcasting in Russian for a Russian audience. Less pressure on foreign journalists. So yes, I'd say this is unusual.
And from one journalist's arrest in Russia to another journalist's warning about Russia, this is Dmitry Muratov, who's the former winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and I understand you've been speaking to him.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, actually. I mean, he is the former winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. That, doesn't guarantee him protection. It hasn't protected his newspaper, which has been closed down by the authorities. It didn't protect him from being physically attacked last year on a train as someone threw red paint at him laced with acetone. And what he said in the interview is not going to change minds in the Kremlin. But, in a society like Russia's, where clearly repression is growing, political persecution against opponents is growing, to speak to someone who is not afraid of going on the record and speaking out, I found that quite interesting.
Задает вопрос, почему не выходит? Я говорю, кто куда выйдет? Причем эти люди...
The Russian authorities may have shut down his newspaper, but Dmitry Muratov refuses to be silenced. When we meet in Moscow, Russia's Nobel Peace Prize laureate is worried about how far the Kremlin will go in its confrontation with the West.
Два, считайте, поколения жили без ядерной угрозы.
2 generations have lived without the threat of nuclear war. But this period is over. Will Putin press the nuclear button or won't he? Who knows? No one knows this. There isn't a single person who can say for sure.
С полной уверенностью скажет нет, не нажмем.
Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, Moscow's nuclear saber-rattling has been loud and frequent. There have been strategic nuclear drills and unsubtle hints to the West not to push Russia too far. A few days ago, Vladimir Putin announced plans to station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. And then, one of his closest aides warned that Russia has a unique weapon capable of destroying any enemy, including America. Is it all a bluff? Well, Dmitry Muratov has picked up some worrying signals.
Мы же видим, как российская пропаганда готовит народ к тому, что ядерная война – это неплохо.
In Russia, we see how state propaganda is preparing people to think that nuclear war isn't a bad thing. On TV channels here, nuclear war and nuclear weapons are promoted as if they're advertising pet food. They announce, we've got this missile, that missile, another kind of missile. They talk about targeting Britain and France, about sparking a nuclear tsunami that washes away America. Why do they say this? So that people here are ready.
Люди в России были облучены пропагандой.
People in Russia have been irradiated by propaganda. Propaganda is a type of radiation. Everyone is susceptible to it, not just Russians. In Russia, propaganda is 12 TV channels, tens of thousands of newspapers, social media, like the Russian version of Facebook, that completely serve the state ideology.
Если завтра не станет пропагандой.
But what if, I asked Dmitry Muratov, what if tomorrow the propaganda suddenly stops? If it all goes quiet, what would Russians think and say then?
Вижу, что молодое, великолепное, образованное, прекрасное поколение.
Our younger generation is wonderful. They're well educated. Nearly 1 million Russians have left the country. Many of those who've stayed are categorically against what is happening in Ukraine. They are against the hell that Russia has created there. I am convinced that as soon as the propaganda stops, this generation, and everyone else with common sense, will speak out.
Last year, Dmitry Muratov auctioned off his Nobel Peace Prize to raise money for Ukrainian child refugees. What does he think the future holds for Russia?
Я вижу, что больше никогда.
Never again will there be normal relations between the people of Russia and the people of Ukraine. Never. In Russia, political repression will continue against all opponents of the regime. My only hope lies with the young generation that see this world as a friend, not as an enemy. They want Russia to be loved and for Russia to love the world. I hope that this generation will outlive me and Putin.
Much will depend on what happens in Ukraine, on when and how this war ends, and what the political consequences will be for the Kremlin leader who ordered the invasion.
And that was the BBC's Russia editor Steve Rosenberg speaking to the Russian Nobel Peace Prize winner Dmitry Muratov there. And let's stick with the Russian theme for a moment, because earlier today a court in Switzerland found 4 former senior executives at the Zurich Bank branch of Russia's Gazprom Bank guilty of a lack of due diligence in the case of suspected money laundering by a close associate of President Putin. They were each given a 7-month suspended sentence for helping the high-profile cellist Sergei Roldugin deposit millions of dollars in the bank without providing any credible explanation of where the cash came from, which under Swiss law is not allowed. Let's get more now from Maria Nizzero, who's a research fellow at the Centre of Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, a security think tank here in London. Maria, thanks for coming on. First of all, tell us a little bit more about exactly what they've been found guilty of.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for having me. So this is a very, it looks like quite of a straightforward case of, what it is expected of bankers to do, which is essentially to conduct the proper due diligence on whatever individual or entity decides to enter in a business relationship with them. So financial institutions under international standards, they are required to, first of all, verify who wants to actually enter in this business relationship. And then, obviously, if they want to open an account, they have to verify the source of funds. So understanding whether the individual who is, engaging with them is the actual ultimate beneficial owner of the assets, and also whether the assets, are of licit origin or illicit.
Of the 4 bankers, 3 of them are Russian. We're not allowed to name them for legal reasons, but we understand they will appeal this. But what happens next? What happens to the money in the bank? And does Sergei Roldugin face any potential charges?
So it really depends. First of all, depends on the appeal and what the appeal says. What happens to the assets now is if the appeal is unsuccessful, so it is actually proven that there was a failure of due diligence, then we would have to answer the other question, which is then who owns actually the money. So that would be probably up to the investigators, the Swiss investigators, to trace the ultimate beneficial owner, which in many cases, as we know, it's quite complicated because it's often hidden behind a very complex structures of shell companies and other names. So it will be the destiny of those, the fate of those assets really depends on what the appeal says.
Yeah, some people are pointing to the actual sentence, 7-month suspended. It seems quite a light sentence, really. Is it much of a deterrent?
That is the chicken and egg question on compliance in itself. How do you manage to get financial institutions to comply with anti-money laundering, counterterrorism financing standards while not necessarily placing too much of a burden on them, but making them understanding that what they're doing is absolutely crucial, not just for the sound and for protecting the soundness of our financial system, but also for our national security, really, because as we're seeing with the latest events, it is a matter of national security. So it really depends on whether we want to use the stick and the carrot dilemma. Definitely heftier fines, heftier sentences might disincentivize some. For others, it's probably a matter of understanding why we're doing what we're doing and why compliance is there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting stuff. Thank you so much for joining us live here on NewsHour. That was Maria Nizzero there, Research Fellow at the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, which is a security think tank here in London. You're with NewsHour from the BBC. Still to come, could a simple blood test prevent unnecessary chemotherapy treatment for thousands of bowel cancer patients every year? Apparently so, according to new research conducted here in the UK.
Half the patients with stage 3 bowel cancer are cured by surgery alone. I hope through this trial that we generate the evidence to show that this technology, liquid biopsies, can be used to spare patients with stage 3 bowel cancer unnecessary chemotherapy after their bowel cancer surgery, because they don't need it.
More on that to come. Other headlines this hour. The US newspaper, The Wall Street Journal, has expressed deep concern for the safety of one of its reporters who's been arrested in Russia. And 4 bankers who helped one of President Putin's closest friends move millions of dollars through a Swiss branch of the Russian bank. This is Rebecca Kesby with NewsHour live from the BBC. Now, Brazil's former far-right president Jair Bolsonaro has arrived in the capital, Brasilia, having flown in from self-imposed exile in Florida. Mr. Bolsonaro left Brazil in December after narrowly losing the presidential election to his left-wing rival Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in October. Since the result, Mr. Bolsonaro's supporters have staged nationwide demonstrations and in January stormed government buildings. The security in Brasilia has been stepped up today in case of further clashes. One of the first challenges Jair Bolsonaro faces on his return is a list of legal cases against him. Let's get more details on all that with Terence McCoy, Rio de Janeiro bureau chief for The Washington Post. Welcome to the programme.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, first of all, can I ask you a very simple question? Why has Bolsonaro chosen to go home, given what he faces in the courts? Many were anticipating that he might try to extend his stay in the USA.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think there are a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to his sabbatical and self-imposed exile in the United States. The first question is, why did he even go in the first place? And why did he come back? A lot of it appears to be because of the different legal challenges that he's facing. He's in the grip of 20 different investigations, many of which are electoral in nature, which could ultimately disqualify him politically. Others are criminal, which could ultimately lead to his arrest, although advisors and legal analysts say here that the risk as of yet is low. But now that he's back in the country, the question now becomes, what is he going to do next?
Well, yes, and that, as you say, that's the big question. Apparently, he was speaking to CNN before he boarded the plane and said that he plans to tour the country campaigning ahead of local elections next year, I think they are. He still has a sizable support base, doesn't he? What kind of an opposition figure might he be?
Well, Bolsonaro is the most polarizing figure in Brazil, and he is a figure who is unique on the right here that has a capacity to galvanize different right-wing blocs from evangelicals to military figures to people who are evangelists for guns. He is someone who is able to accumulate all these different blocs into a large right-wing force. A lot of the other right-wing figures in the country don't really have the same sort of charisma or capacity to amass followings in the streets. So his return to the country to a deeply polarized country is something of an equilibrium in a way of what we've had for the last number of years between a very energized left and a very energized right. So his decision now to tour the country, especially the Northeast, the projection is he's going to start taking motorcycle rallies throughout the Northeast. Yeah. That is another sign that Brazil, what was a brief respite during his self-imposed exile, is returning to a very polarized and politically engaged state. And it could be a real headache for President Lula, couldn't it? Because every court case provides some kind of platform for Mr. Bolsonaro to take to, for his supporters to rally around. Exactly. Lula appeared in no hurry to have Bolsonaro return to the country. In fact, it seemed like he was content to have Bolsonaro in the United States because it get him out of his hair. Bolsonaro is an antagonist and is already criticizing Lula's government as soon as he's got returned back to the country today. So this is something that it didn't seem like the left was anxious to have him back as well. So it is something that should be a headache for Lula. And Terence, just briefly, we think that some of these legal challenges could be imminent even in the next few days. Yeah, so he's facing a legal challenge right now. His government is about a question of jewelry from Saudi Arabia. Jewelry that's highly expensive, worth millions of dollars, and also ended up in the possession of Bolsonaro's personal possession. They were saying that was his. But the Brazilian courts were saying, wait a second, this belongs to the Brazilian people. So that sort of drama over what happened to this jewelry, how did it end up in Bolsonaro's possession, is a question that he's facing right now and expected actually to give testimony in this week. So some of these cases are heating up and could be coming to a resolution quicker than people expect.
OK, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. That's Terence McCoy there, Bureau Chief for The Washington Post in Rio. Can a dormant 4-decade-old nuclear reactor that's never been run be revived and put safely into operation? That is the question that's now stirring controversy in the Philippines, because in the 1970s, the autocratic leader Ferdinand Marcos put the Philippines on a path to become the first country in Southeast Asia with nuclear power. But when he was deposed in 1986, his grand plan was frozen. The Batan plant, which has just been completed, was mothballed. Well, now, nearly 40 years later, the dead dictator's son wants to revive his father's dream. From the Batan, Rupert Winfield-Hayes reports.
I'm at a place called the Bataan Peninsula. In front of me here is what should have been the Philippines' first nuclear power plant. This plant was built on the orders of Ferdinand Marcos back in the 1970s. It was supposed to come online in 1986, but then Marcos was brought down, his dictatorship ended, and this plant was mothballed. Nearly 4 decades later, there is now another Ferdinand Marcos in the presidential palace in Manila, and he's determined to finish what his father started. The man leading his campaign is in a white helicopter, currently circling the plant, looking for a place to land.
This is a peninsula.
Congressman Mark Coangco is the ebullient nephew of another former Philippine president, Cory Aquino.
Warm water comes out, not hot.
But these days he is a key supporter of President Marcos and an enthusiast for nuclear power.
So this is the control room. Wow, this looks like a movie set.
This is 1970s technology. It's all analog. There's nothing digital about this at all. All the readouts, all the dials are analog, all the switches. Here in front of me is the master switch to drop the control rods into the reactor. And I guess the question here is, how is this going to be updated if they're really going to get this plant online? Renovating an old plant like this has been done before in the US state of Tennessee.
The reference case for me is Watts Bar 2, which was initiated 6 years prior to this plant. They mothballed it just like this plant. In 2009, they decided, let's finish this plant. In 2016, it became America's newest nuclear plant.
The congressman's enthusiasm to get this plant running is not shared by everyone. People who live near the Bataan plant look at what happened to those living around the Fukushima plant in Japan and fear the same could happen to them.
Here in the Philippines, it's always being devastated by typhoons, and we have a lot of earthquakes.
Derek Kabe is a leader of the nuclear-free Bataan movement.
It's a sleeping monster. That's why we cannot let the monster be awake again.
But opinion polls show the majority of Filipinos are now behind the Marcos plan. And there's one big reason.
Welcome back to NewsHour. Now, just when you thought the big screen awards season was over, it's the turn of the small screen. Tonight are the BAFTA Games Awards. They've been going for nearly 20 years. And tonight, the big computer games to watch out for are apparently God of War, Ragnarok, where you get to do battle with Norse gods, the Cat Simulator, Stray, I think that one must be about cats, and the Elden Ring, which is a dark fantasy role-playing epic. Let's speak to someone who can tell us more about this. Stefan Powell is the BBC's gaming correspondent. Great job title. Stefan, what are the likely winners this year?
Well, what is likely with the BAFTA Games Awards is that we can't tell you who's likely to win because they always throw up a surprise. Now, on paper, you'd think that God of War Ragnarok, that you talked about there, is a very famous PlayStation franchise that was reinvented in 2018. That's the most nominated game in history. There are 14 nominations for that one. So you'd think, on paper, right then, this must be God of War's year. And the previous game in 2018 actually won the BAFTA. But this award ceremony likes throwing up surprises because alongside games like God of War Ragnarok, which has been created by teams of hundreds of developers, artists, producers, there are also titles like Vampire Survivor, for example, which was made by one man. nominated in the same category.
Wow.
So there's a real variety out there. It's decided by a jury of experts who work in the industry, so they do like throwing up a surprise or two.
There does seem to be a bit more variety in the subject matter too. There seem to be fewer guns, more swords and cats. I mean, is that a trend that we can see at the moment?
Absolutely. You think the games industry is relatively young when compared to its older siblings, film and television. It's only really been around since the late 70s. And so therefore, that maturation process has taken its time, and now we are seeing the variety and the diversity of the people creating games probably being reflected in the type of games that we're seeing there. You're having these games like God of War, like Elden Ring, big fantasy epics, competing alongside games where you play as a stray cat, or a title like Ollie Ollie World, which is a skateboard simulator where you just go around in circles in a very meditative state playing on a skateboard. So there's a real variety out there.
Obviously, it's nice to win awards, but what does it actually mean if you get to take home a BAFTA Games Award in terms of industry recognition and so on?
Well, I think it's actually more than just industry recognition, because there are other awards that the industry values, but it's a broader cultural appreciation of the impact of gaming. We know how much money games make. Here in the UK, for example, 4.7 billion pounds in terms of sales last year, right? More than any other entertainment sector. So we know the numbers are good economically, but what BAFTA does is it gives it that cultural recognition. A BAFTA Golden Mask is recognised world over as being something that recognises the highest and the best of the arts and culture. And so gaming is now in that space. And that's why these events, tonight's event is so important.
Very nice to speak to you. Thank you so much for coming in. That's the BBC's gaming correspondent, Stefan Powell there.
Hoover Institution, as well as the Copenhagen Consensus, his organization, commenting on the ambition of the year 2000, a lot of history since then. We're in the third decade of the 21st century, and it's not clear where we're going. And the year 2015, when the nations came together for goals to do with net zero, with climate change, with concerns about the deterioration of the Earth's sustainability. However, at the same time, the United Nations made a much longer list. The simple way was to say laundry list, but that's inappropriate here. It's a list of political thinking in 2015. Here we are halfway to the target, 2015 to 2030, and very little of this has been achieved. And you could say, well, listen, we're at a war in Europe, and the Global South is evidencing mass migration that comes up against the conflicts with the Global North, so why do you hold us accountable? Well, the fact is these ambitions are worthwhile. So Bjorn has identified in his National Post piece one goal that, after reading about it, seems immediately achievable. In fact, I'm amazed that it hasn't happened yet. Bjorn, how do we end tuberculosis?
Well, it's actually very, very simple, because we've already done it in the rest of the world. Remember, tuberculosis was probably the leading killer in the 1800s. We estimate 1/4 of everyone who died in the 1800s died from tuberculosis. Over the last 200 years, about 1 billion people have died from tuberculosis. A lot of the people you think about from the 18 and early 1900s died from tuberculosis. Yet we fixed it because it's a bacteria. You just give people drugs, simple drugs, and then it disappears. Now, it's actually not quite as simple, because you need to take it for 4 or 6 months. And that's one of the troubles, that it's hard to get people to keep taking their medication. You know, if you get a pill and you have to take it for 2 weeks, when you get well, you start forgetting to do it. If you actually have to do this for 4 months, that's a little harder. And so you need some more engagement to get people to do it. The second part is, we need to find a lot of the people who are not diagnosed right now. So we estimate about 10 to 11 million people are sick with tuberculosis every year, but only about 6 million of them are discovered. So there's 4 million who basically don't get any medication, and many of them will die, but they also transmit the disease. That's why it's still the leading infectious disease. It's not COVID in 2022. It was tuberculosis, killing 1.4 million people. So we really need to do something about it. And the amazing thing is, it is so cheap. This is one of the 12 best investments for the world. If we invest it in, and we would have to pay about $6.2 billion more per year, but then we could basically cut tuberculosis almost entirely. We'd end up with a couple 100,000 cases by the end of 2050, but we'd basically save about 1 million lives every year till mid-century. That's an amazing achievement.
We'd improve the ambitions of the families around the people who struggle. Remember, we used to write operas about tuberculosis, La Boheme. You know, we celebrated it in the North, and then it disappeared. And I read about it, thanks to you, Bjorn. I realized that the areas to focus the investment in education are Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Western Pacific, especially India and China and Indonesia. All governances that are effectively well organized now for education and money. And so you can apply yourself to a success and do it by 2030. Is that imaginable?
Oh, absolutely. This is something we promised for a very long time. So we keep promising we're going to give more money to tuberculosis, and we keep not doing it. And I think the simple answer is it's because it's not top of mind. It's very sort of ironic that you just read about it in the paper. I'm very happy you did. We're actually writing in 35 papers around the world. So you read about it in one of the Rich World papers, but we write about it in Times of India and many other places around the world. And we try to get this message out that this is one of the very, very good investments. But fundamentally, the problem is the people who die, so the 1.4 million people who die every year, are the least powerful people in the world. They typically live in slum areas or in transitory areas or in prison communities or in mining communities. They're people who don't have very much power, and therefore, a lot of people just don't care all that much about them. But surely we owe it both to the world, to them, to their kids, that they don't die, but also, of course, stopping this incredibly devastating infectious disease. And when we have it within our power and can do so very, very cheaply, I think we really should.